Three, two, one. We are live on Facebook.
Good afternoon. My name is Adnan Morshed, and I'm a professor in the School of Architecture and Planning at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. I would like to welcome you all to the final panel conversation of our 2021 Spring Panel Series, Spatiality, Urbanity, and Pedagogy in a Post-Pandemic World. In the first panel on spatiality, in February, we asked if the global pandemic and our responses to it triggered conditions for reimagining architecture, domesticity, and space as public health. We examined how biopolitics of the pandemic intersected with architecture's ability to foster humanity and well-being. In the Urbanity panel in March, we asked how would cities respond to unimaginable economic, social, public health, urban, and environmental consequences of the pandemic. What lessons could cities draw from this experience to ensure urbanity meets social justice? Today, in the Pedagogy panel, we focus on the future of architectural education in the wake of a viral Armageddon, one that had unprecedented impact on the ways we learn and teach. Online teaching is nothing new, but we are now talking about a global scale of meeting between the physical and the virtual. And we wondered whether we are at an inflection point or we are just experiencing a bump in the history of learning. It was over a year ago, on March 11, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. The world, as we knew it, changed almost overnight. Within a week or two, in-person classes were suspended in the middle of the spring semester. Architecture schools and faculty had to embrace teaching in a way that many schools had previously resisted, even internally scorned, online. Now, ubiquitous video conferencing tool like Zoom suddenly created an alternative geography of virtuality for teachers and students to inhabit and interact. All this happened without any standardization of remote learning, a situation further complicated by students moving to different time zones of the world and their varying socioeconomic conditions. Many teachers wondered about the new exigencies of time management, class preparation, and online tools, while students lamented isolation, online fatigue, and lack of opportunities for peer learning, and most of all, hanging out, which some students claimed, quote, a staple of the life of an architecture student, end quote. With online teaching, campus residency was no longer necessary, which some students appreciated as it saved money. Some detested it because they lost seeing their opportunities for seeing their friends. Some faculty members welcomed the flexibility of residency as it allowed them mobility during the semester. They could be anywhere in the world and still teach their class in a schedule that became 24/7. The line between work life and social life became blurred and fluid. On the optimistic side, online teaching allowed faculty members to invite guest speakers, critiques, and jurors from different time zones, creating unprecedented global connectivity and learning environments that college campuses have not seen before. In a paradoxical way, the pandemic created a new geography of learning, transforming the classroom into an incubator of ideas shared by people from all parts of the world. Some observers predicted that ongoing crisis might even lead to a generational shift from the baby boomers to a new generation of academic leaders. Despite new opportunities, though, students complained about alienation, mental health challenges, and Zoom fatigue. Teachers struggled to come up with efficient but humane ways of assessing student performance, particularly in a discipline like architecture, in which design studios warrant a tactile and learning environment and rigorous teacher-student interaction. The pandemic has exposed our vulnerabilities in dealing with systemic inequities that plague our societies. It also gave us pause to introspect on the state of our lives, cities, policies, institutions, environments, and education. The panel today offers a platform to deliberate on these issues. What are the lessons learned in the last 1 year? What are the shakeups, if any? What might be the changes in not only the technologies of learning, but also what we learn with what goals? Whatever the answers are to these questions, it is worth recalling what Bucky Fuller once said. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Let us welcome our 5 distinguished panelists today. Deborah Burke, FAIA, is an architect, educator, and the Dean of the Yale School of Architecture. Deborah is a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design and the City University of New York. She is the founder of the Deborah Burke Partners. Deborah is a board member and advisor to several notable foundations, including the Norman Foster Foundation. She was a founder and VP of Design One NYC. Deborah is a founding trustee of the Design Trust for Public Space, the National Building Museum, the Brearley School, a chair of the Board of Advisors of the Buell Center for Columbia University, vice president of the AIA New York chapter, and a member of the Pritzker Architecture Prize jury. She has received several awards, such as the Berkeley Rupp Prize, Honorary Doctorate of Fine Arts, and the National Design Award. Mark Jerzenbeck is a professor of history, theory, and criticism program in architecture at MIT. He was a CASVA Fellow, postdoctoral resident fellow at the J. Paul Getty Center for the History of Humanities and Art, a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at the Canadian Center for Architecture, and Starling and Francine Clark Institute. Jerzenbeck has published several books and articles on global history. He wrote Architecture of First Societies, A Global Perspective, Digital Stockholm Syndrome in the Post-Ontological Age, Urban Heterology, Digital Dresden and the Dialectics of Post-Traumatic History. Mark has collaborated on a number of notable works, including A Global History of Architecture with Vikram Prakash and Francine Ching, which, by the way, we use as our textbook in history classes here. He is currently working on a book called Architecture, Modernity, Enlightenment. Mark, along with Vikram Prakash, received a $2.5 million grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and created a new scholarly entity called Global Architecture History Teaching Collaborative. Next up is Nasreen Saraji, who's an architect and educator, currently professor of architectural design at University College Dublin. She has taught at many architecture schools, including the Architectural Association, Columbia University, and Princeton University. She has served as Dean of École Nationale Supérieure d'Architecture Paris Malaquais, professor and head of Department of Architecture at Hong Kong University, professor and head of the Institute of Art and Architecture at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, and professor and chair of the Department of Architecture at Cornell University. Nasrin's practice and research concentrates on collective housing as well as new models of urbanism, which she calls integrative architecture. She's the co-director of the endowed New Towns Lab with Elaine Chiaradia at Hong Kong University. Her book and exhibition, Housing Substance of Our Cities in 2007, is a critical view on 100 years of collective housing in Europe. Her co-edited book, From Crisis to Crisis, Debates on Why Architecture Criticism Matters Today, examines how reading, writing, and criticism can address the urgent issues faced by architecture today. Nasrin has lectured widely in Europe, North America, and Asia and South Africa. She's a fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects and officer of the Arts and Letters in France. Next is Mark Ferguson. He is the recently appointed Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at the Catholic University of America. In his first full-time academic position, Dean Ferguson brings his experience as co-founder and co-leader of Ferguson and Shamamian Architects to educating architects in the university. After earning professional degrees from Carnegie Mellon University and Princeton University, he built a practice in New York City, now 90 people, where he and his colleague have committed their careers to serving clients, building residences and estates. The firm has completed projects, extend regional architectural traditions in 20 states in the US, Canada, and the Bahamas, for which it has received multiple awards and has been recognized in numerous publications. Dean Ferguson is co-author of New Traditional Architecture, Ferguson and Shamamian Architects, City and Country Residences with Oscar Shamamian and Joseph Giovannini. He has taught design as a visiting critic at the Rhode Island School of Design at the University of Miami. Furthering his interest in expanding the knowledge of traditional design in architecture and the allied arts, he is a longstanding director of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, where he served as board chair from 2014 to 2016. And last but not least, Robert Alexander Gonzalez is the Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of New Mexico. He's also president-elect of the Association of the Collegiate Schools of Architecture, ACSA, and he serves on the board of directors of the Architecture Lobby. He has served as principal investigator for a joint $5.9 million Department of Education HSI STEM grants. At UNM, he oversees the school with departments of architecture, community and regional planning, landscape architecture, and historic preservation and regionalism. He has co-authored AULA Symposia at Harvard University, Tulane University, University of New Mexico, and Texas Tech University at El Paso. Gonzalez's field-leading book, Designing Pan America, U.S. Architectural Visions for the Western Hemisphere. His writings have appeared in numerous publications, including Architecture, Architectural Record, JAE, Places, Platform, Revista ARQ. Dr. Gonzalez is the founder of the On the Brink Book Award Plus Lecture Program, sponsored by the John Binkerhoff Jackson Endowment. Tough to pronounce, Robert. Well, so welcome to all of you. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us. We are very appreciative of your spending the time with us. For the methodology of the conversation today, our conversation will continue for an hour and 10 minutes, followed by a 20-minute Q&A. For the attendees, thank you for joining us, and please write your question in the Q&A function in Zoom. Now, Julia, please explain how attendees could get AIA continuing education learning units for this panel. Julia.
Hello, my name is Julia. So as an attendee of today's spring panel series Pedagogy, you have the opportunity of earning AIA continuing education learning units. I will be sharing a Google form link via Zoom chat and Facebook post on CUARC's Facebook page. Please provide us with your first and last name and AIA number. If by chance you are unable to use the Google form, I will be typing my email in the chat and you can email me the information instead. If you have any questions or have trouble accessing the form, feel free to reach out via Zoom chat or Facebook comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. So without further ado, let's get started. And I would like to begin with a general question to all our panelists. So it's a longish question, so bear with me. During the last 1 year, as we anxiously self-quarantine and found unexpected solitude, it dawned on many of us that the pandemic was both a crisis and an opportunity. As we began our lives in an enforced biopolitical space of social distancing, both students and faculty worried about a new era of surveillance within the Zoom space. Many of us were worried about the freedom of speech in the learning environment in which everything could be monitored and disciplined. At the same time, the pandemic gave us an opportunity to look deep into our lives, policies and institutions, environments, and education. In architecture schools across the world, we quickly adapted to remote learning at an unprecedented scale without necessarily understanding its long-term pedagogical implications. Our students wondered, rather anxiously, what virtual learning meant for them, why it would require the same tuition fee, and how it would shape their futures. As the usual tactile environment that is valorized in architectural studios disappeared before we realized it, we panicked but searched for alternative models in online platforms and came to terms with virtual spatiality. As pandemic domesticity and urbanity reconfigured our sense of space, we were compelled to rethink the project of architecture and its pedagogy. The last 1 year has been a time for looking both outward and inward. How do you think the experience of the pandemic might change architectural pedagogies in the long run? Do you foresee any permanent shakeups in the way we teach architecture? What is the future of architectural education as a result of what we have learned and experienced in the last 1 year? So I was hoping that you would state this rather long question as your opening statement of five minutes. So perhaps we can start with Deborah.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Adnan, and greetings, I want to say, to my wonderful colleagues from the world of architectural education. It's a privilege to participate in this conversation. Adnan had asked us in advance to prepare a statement in response to that question, the question of the kind of vulnerabilities and loneliness and the profound societal inequities that have been brought to the fore by the pandemic. And you ask us how the pandemic might change architectural pedagogy and architectural education. I honestly feel that I have been asked this question dozens and dozens of times in the 13 months since we started Zoom teaching and remote learning. And although Yale has been open and our students have been able to work in studio this academic year, the omnipresence of Zoom, including Zoom desk crits, has certainly shaken up many aspects of the studio teaching model. That said, I am frankly not all that interested in questions about pedagogy, the university, and how they relate to the pandemic. What I am interested in is how architectural education addresses the real problem facing all humanity, which is the global climate crisis, of which the pandemic is a very ugly symptom. But there are other ugly symptoms that we as architects must address. First, we as architects must be explicit and insistent on addressing architecture's role in the global climate crisis. Some aspects of remote teaching might help with this, but they will be minor, so we must do more. Second, we must recognize the importance of the city, as one of the sessions in this series already did. More than 55% of the world's population now lives in cities, and all these people need access to housing, education, medical care, and parks, among many other things, many of them related to the built environment, buildings and infrastructure, all of what we can call architecture spelled with a small a. We need to make sure that cities do not sprawl and claim ever more greenfield sites, but that they are dense and defined as a way to protect the natural environment, not take the pandemic as an excuse to de-densify. In our cities, we need to also learn how to defend privacy from the techniques of surveillance and manipulation that limit many things, including creativity. And we are at a moment where surveillance and manipulation relates to healthcare, and we have to watch this closely. Third, I think we as educators must do everything we can to foster, encourage, and make possible diversity in our profession. We must reflect the diversity of our society and the talents of its many intricate and overlapping cultures. We need to acknowledge in schools that architects alone don't determine the built environment. We are part of a very large team that includes structural, mechanical, and civil engineers, among others, acousticians, lighting designers, sustainability consultants, wayfinding consultants, preservationists, landscape architects, botanists, environmentalists, urban planners, regional planners, transportation engineers, all of these professions with similar issues of underrepresentation of women and minorities. We need to address the complex choreography of construction, which includes skilled teams of people who can form and pour concrete, frame with timber or steel, plumb, wire, waterproof, tile, paint. And then we need to ask, who gets to do this? How do we train them? How much do we pay them? How much do they respect what we do or we what they do? And how do we address that when we're wrong? And of course, we need to challenge who decides what can and can't be done. How tall can it be? What use type can it be? Where can you build? What can you build? And who exactly are we building for? At the end of the day, in my opinion, the climate crisis is actually about justice. And our part of it as architects is built environment social justice. And whether we teach through Zoom or not, what we must teach our students is how to create an architecture of the greater good. I think separate from the many burdens of remote learning across time zones and the benefits of remote learning for the many reasons that Adnan mentioned in his introduction, the how we teach is not the primary issues at all. There are many ways to teach. What we teach is the issue, and this year has made that ever more apparent.
Thank you, Deborah. Who'd like to go next?
I can go next.
Okay, Robert.
Oops, sorry about that. Yeah, well, I think for me, I do feel like it's a time to reflect on our models of teaching. And I see that it's quite ironic that here we were forced to stay at home for almost an entire year. And even though we experienced that unpleasantness, I think a lot of us felt more connected more than ever. And that's because we had to connect in very special ways. So I'm thinking of this next period as a new era of some kind of democratic connectivity that we did not know existed before. Maybe we did, but we've all been jolted and we've had to live it. This new democratic connectivity affects students, I think, and will affect students in different ways. We've seen new ways for students to collaborate across universities. We've seen new ways for students and faculty to connect. The question of accommodation, which has always been a very important and sensitive topic for students at universities, will be blurred. And we are now understanding that we don't always have to be in a classroom. We don't always have to be together. So I feel like students are going to experience a democratic connectivity that is not the norm. And that's going to push the way we teach, and it's going to push the way faculty are forced to pivot and to accommodate. We also see this kind of connectivity with curricular development, and Black Matter University, I think, is just the tip of the iceberg of a greater network of academics working together. They're committed to new forms of knowledge and knowledge production, institutions, collectivity, practice, community, culture, design. They are hoping to reinvent in many ways models that have just been stayed models that we just took for granted. And I'm optimistic. I see this as a moment of optimism for curricular reform. And lastly, teaching models. I believe schools have, many have claimed sort of prominence with pedigreed faculty rosters, with rosters of faculty that you could only access if you went to those universities. I think we're going to increasingly see roaming faculty, new faculty who are connected to multiple universities. And that's also going to be a paradigm shift that will affect teaching and will affect what universities have to offer.
Thank you, Robert.
Adnan?
Yes, go ahead, Mark.
Well, thank you for agreeing to be the creative director and the producer of this series of discussions. You converted what started as a liability into an asset, and you've brought our community a little bit closer together, to Robert's point about connectivity. I think we're too close to the pandemic to know its lasting impact, but I'm in complete agreement with Deborah that it has shined a light and illuminated some of the problems, the pressing problems that face all of us working, living as engaged citizens. But the question of pedagogy is an important one for a dean, especially a new dean coming to academia from a career in practice. In practice, I spend a good deal of time recruiting, teaching, and coaching young architects. I help them build careers. Some of them have become my partners. At the university, I intend to apply and am applying that experience, helping others build their careers. The ideas that guide and animate my practice grew out of my experience as a student, as a teenager, especially a student of theory, criticism, and history. These are subjects that often raise more questions than answers. So, leaving school with some difficult questions, I set out to try to answer them through practice. And in co-founding my business, developed a set of ideas that focused on traditional architecture, those things that seem perennial through the ages, rather than those things that change. I realized architects are in a service business. We offer advice to other people so they can find and shape their place in the world. We do this by designing buildings and the spaces around buildings. We design places that are safe, orienting, they have identity, they provide a sense of belonging for the people that live and work there. They're beautiful and uplifting. The pandemic reminds us that simple things like fresh air, street life, and parks are what good buildings and durable communities offer to us. Placemaking is a negotiation between an individual and a community. Both want something from each other. The patron of a new building wants something from the site. There's something about that place that offers value. to that person. And the community wants something from the person who puts a building down there. There's should be agreement when they're done, and that agreement should offer something to both of them. Architects set new buildings down among existing buildings, and these create ensembles. We call them streets, blocks, neighborhoods, campuses, towns, and cities. It's a collaboration with other architects across time, the architects in the past and the architects that will come in the future. It's important that these ensembles are coherent, legible, convey meaning that celebrates the local culture, the landscape, the climate, building practices, and the purpose of the building. Private buildings shape public places. Architecture is ultimately a civic art. We are the stewards of the public realm, whether it's in a rural place, a small town, or the central city. We are urban designers. It's our job to connect the art of building with making communities. This is our mission at Catholic University of America. Here, we prepare students for practice, and we expect them to become worldly, cultured, and engaged citizens. We expect them to develop good interpersonal skills, the ability to communicate, to collaborate, to lead. We expect them to develop the drawing and writing skills needed for careful observation, for thinking, and for communicating ideas. We expect them to know the discipline of architecture, how buildings get built, the forms they take, how they're put together, what keeps them standing up, what keeps the weather out, and how we make comfortable interiors. We expect them to think like a designer. This is the architect's core skill, applicable to any vocation. It's the ability to define a problem, assemble a team of experts, research the problem, analyze your findings, generate alternate design concepts, edit them, develop them, present, evaluate them, refine, represent them, and to do all of this on a predictable timetable and a budget. The pandemic has not changed what clients need or desire or how we serve them. The pandemic has pushed us to work with clients almost exclusively through digital drawings and models viewed on a computer monitor. The computer monitor, whether it's the small one sitting on your desk or a large one in a conference table or conference room, has become the primary interface for all drawings and meetings. The ability to zoom in and out, to move around to different views, to consider the experience of the building in time, to modify the design on the fly in 3D, creates a rich understanding of the design for a client. While digital drawing has enhanced communication, it's not diminished the need to draw by hand, to think and explain ideas. Although the pandemic has changed the physical office, before the pandemic, we were 4% remote. Today, we are 96% remote. It has not changed the way we organize ourselves in small teams to take on projects from beginning to end. Our work is highly collaborative. Beginning on Labor Day this year, we hope to bring everyone back to the office, giving them the flexibility to work remotely when it enhances their productivity. This requires trust and discipline. We believe everyone, except the confirmed introverts, will prefer working in the office. It builds community. It encourages learning, bonding, collaborating, and most importantly, the opportunity to take an interest in the well-being of people beyond one's immediate sphere of influence. This interest in others has been key to our company's growth. It has built a community, and this is the lesson of the pandemic. The world needs more community builders.
Thank you, Mark. Who will be next? Nasreen, Mark.
Okay.
Okay. All right, Mark.
Thank you, Adnan, for organizing this. I appreciate the opportunity and for the conversation. Architectural education is a very tradition-bound reality. It gets its current shape mostly got its most currently shaped mostly in the late 19th century when architecture began to professionalize. So the future is, in some sense, perhaps written already on the walls. And that has serious problems, of course, especially since the urgency for innovation can lead one to assume that innovation is good in for itself before we fully understand the constraints that are to be found in the studio. I would say that generally studios have begun to do a much better job in addressing what we might call local, but do a terrible job in getting to the question of global. Just because one does a housing studio in China does not mean global. Just because students come from Asia does not mean the studio is global. Just because a professor has built something arbitrarily in another country does not mean global. Unfortunately, much that passes of local is equally overdetermined and still based on assumptions that a type of social authenticity is built into the local, which is only a half-truth, or perhaps a convenient truth that speaks to the culture and sometimes the cult of naive humanism. We should not assume that by doing something local, we are doing the right thing when we might just be satisfying an unreflective liberalist sensibility that is in practice anything but liberalism, but just so much downward-oriented opportunism. The local is not a single thing and can be just as fractured, tortured, tormented, complex as some not local, and can be just as riddled with red herrings as with authentic voices. We have learned in the last year or so that the local might not be quite as truly local as we sometimes think, depending on who is speaking and when they were speaking. In every local, there are sublocals, power elites, repressed voices, and the like. MIT would like to think that it has always had a soft spot for local concerns. But my studio seminar on Native American land issues and the one done by Sheila Kennedy from last semester was the first time Native American issues and Native American activists, as real people, were part of a conversation about a site in the entire history of MIT. Why did it take so damn long? Other universities might well point out that they have a stronger connection to local issues, and that may be fair enough. But because globalization, these narratives often have been seen as antithetical to global. I would say that both the local and the global have to be seen not as check marks in some curriculum, but as part of an engagement with what I would call world opening. We would all like to think that as educators, we do and work within world opening situations. But the truth is that this is more a fiction than reality, despite the fact that we have studios in China or elsewhere. At a conference a few years ago, a prominent dean leaned over to me and told me that they do not need to teach global architectural history since they send students to China for a week. I hope I didn't roll my eyes. The classic case of lazy institutionalism. A dean in a prominent school of architecture in Germany told me that they don't need to teach global history because the students come from all over the world, but they know nothing about Germany. So they have to all take a course on German castles. So is that what we mean by local? So how do we use local to produce world opening is just as valid a problem as how we use global to produce world opening. What the pandemic has shown without doubt that not traveling is not good. I think that every architectural student should take a gap year or maybe gap years to travel. But that, of course, is only one bit of the question of how to engage the need of being world open. Autodidacticism is the first step, but our academe has to play a second and third steps as well. For the academic world produces a social condenser. And that's, of course, in the case with the reason for the wonderful aspect that we would call studio as a condenser space where one learns most effectively about others and about one's own positionality vis-a-vis others and otherness, thus the value. Often there's been a type of hypocrisy, though, in the making of others for others without really understanding the difficulty of speaking in a world of different languages, different types of genders, different classes, different class awarenesses, different voice capacities, and on and on. So what Robert has called the new era connectivity, I think has a lot of promise as it gets us past the banality of the social networks, which until now did not really pan out as impactful in the studio as we had hoped, but maybe now will. A few years ago, some particularly enterprising students here ran a studio with the Perkins School for the Blind, which is located in Watertown, not too far from where I live. It was for them, I shall say, eye-opening to work with people who may not see well, but who understand space through hearing and smell. Yes, it is unlikely that the normative students will need that skill when they go out and work for KPF. But the issue is not about pragmatism. It is how to rewire one's brain, how to get future architects to understand the world as different from their expectations, and how easy it is for architects to force people into the preset worldviews. Modern architecture these days asks everyone to assimilate to its forces. I'm speaking generally here. There are exceptions, of course. From that perspective, most of architectural education is not particularly world opening. Doesn't challenge the student to see, think, or hear the world differently. See, think, or hear the world through difference. And so that, I think, is where we need to put our energies.
Thank you, Mark. Nasreen?
Thank you. Thank you, Adnan. Thank you for everybody having done the job. Let's see. Thank you for putting this together, because it actually makes all of us think about what have we been doing really in the past sort of year or so. Well, I will be speaking from the point of view of a Franco-British Persian living in Europe and having experienced a variety of conditions of the pandemic teaching since January 22 in Asia, North America, and Europe. I've experienced teaching from home, from a hotel, and from my university office online, sometimes without a mask, and for a short period of 3 months, face-to-face with a mask. I've experienced faculty meetings with masks with all windows open for ventilation, and being bitten, everybody being bitten by mosquitoes because of the amount of air that has to come in and go out. We've been online and having about 60 people online on a sort of a, like everybody else, like all of you have experienced, I'm sure, on these faculty meetings. I've done this across the 3 continents and online lectures, debates, reviews, thesis reviews, competition evaluations, charrette workshops, admissions talks and Q&As, as well as research investigations and PhD seminars. The future of architectural education is a vast question, though. It depends on where, why, and to what end. We all remember the famous quote by Giancarlo De Carlo, not that long ago, only 50 years ago, in his essay titled Legitimizing Architecture. It was 1972, I think, where he said that architecture has become, or had become at that time, too important to leave it to architects. Now, 50 years later, we need to revisit, I think, the question and see how we can legitimize architecture in the 21st century, when the pandemic is only one of the urgencies amongst a multitude of other urgent questions, such as climate catastrophes, deforming geographies, and having grave consequences on siting and land economics. Wealth and poverty lines are shifting constantly, and the distance between them is further and further. The financial divide is making it almost impossible to be housed on a modest income. Digital fabrication is not ubiquitous. In spite of all the digital equality hype that we have around us, we cannot simply forget the relationship of labor to fabrication. 5,000 beams, all at different dimensions, would cost much less to produce in China by hand labor than in Switzerland. And perhaps the robotic arm is only a decoy. I would invite all of those that haven't seen this fantastic film by Harun Farooqi that demonstrates the making of bricks around the world. And in the film is called In Comparison, to watch it. We could perhaps look at new pedagogies in comparison and not in competition. Having said all of this, as a preamble, I solemnly believe the curriculum or the curricula of schools of architecture are long overdue for a major rehaul, from north to south and from east to west. In 2006, 14 years before the pandemic hit us, we devised a new curriculum at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. 5 research design platforms brought together a triptych form, in a triptych form. The urgencies of the European continent were then debated. The triptych structure, like geography, landscape, city, would allow for a triangular reading of the issues, or simply the interdependence or integrative concept of each field. In the case of history, theory, criticism, we completely displaced its teaching and took it into the design platform using various historiographic methods in order for students to understand history through alternative means and methods. The platform system is therefore an agile and resilient, and therefore a resilient curriculum. Issues are interchangeable and disposable. It allows students to question and problematize issues from first year onwards. It is not progressive teaching or learning. It is not about abstract fundamentals of architecture. I propose new pedagogies based on images and the understanding of the world through graphic knowledge. The paintings of the Chauvet caves proved to us that 35,000 years ago, mankind had wished to convey its experience through drawings. Adnan, I've been a little bit naughty and I've gone to some of your other questions in order to finish my 5 minutes. And that goes to, on evaluation and assessment, I don't adhere to the word performance when we talk about gaining knowledge. It is easy to see who has learned what through the production and translation of research into critical work that in turn becomes new knowledge. On the questions concerning the Pritzker Prize establishment, I would like to pass, but as I think that the institution of architectural practice is light years away from the environment of schools, the preconceived idea of the divide between the quote unquote real world and the academic world needs to be revisited with caution. And I would argue that the real world is in our universities, where we are not worried about the client's whims, nor the image with which a mayor needs to be re-elected, allowing the project to be at the center of the debate and not an alibi for it.
Nasreen, can I pose that question to everybody? And I would actually like to see how everybody responds to that Pritzker question. So perhaps we can move on to, were you done, or can I move on to the next question?
No, I haven't done. I'm not yet done yet. But you can bring back the question.
Yes, I'd like to pose that question to everybody. So
sure.
I was talking to a number of students, and in fact, I talked to my entire class about these about performance. You know, even though Nasreen, you kind of don't like the word performance, but it is in the mind of students. So I would like to.
Oh, we should take it out, maybe.
I would like to pose this question to everybody: that what is the future of student quote and unquote performance assessment. If the future learning is a hybrid of physical and virtual domains, how do we recalibrate assessment, testing, exams, and most important, end of semester activities like juries? How do we assess students, what they do, whether they create critical knowledge or whatever do? We, at the end of the day, university requires that we assess their performance. What is the future of that assessment in a hybrid learning environment? So anybody can take on that question.
I'm sorry, Nasreen didn't get to finish her description of what was wrong with assessment, because I think I was in agreement, but if you would keep going, it would be fascinating for me.
Nasreen, do you wanna continue on that? So now that students, our attendees can relate to what you were talking about in greater detail. So I think this is the time if you can reflect on your.
I wasn't saying that I don't adhere to the word assessment. I don't adhere to the word performance. Performance is a very business. I mean, it's, you know, performance of what? Performance of dancers perform, but we don't evaluate their performance. You know, we go to dance. So I think that this maybe I'm just too much of a European, but this word performance immediately sort of shifts the idea of production of knowledge into something that has a value, and we only look at that value if it is. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of assessment versus performance, assessment of performance. So when it comes to assessment, I mean, of course you have to assess what has been done, but can't we do that through, isn't there a possibility of doing that through publications? Why does publications and printed matter have to be something that is only for research and PhD students? Why can't it be through, you know, do we have to still go on with giving A+ and A-? I think there are many questions here that come and I just open this up as a discussion, but I think that there is a lot of misconception in terms of what it is that we're learning and what it is that we are producing as knowledge, and how is that being evaluated. And that evaluation, of course, in different places has, you know, I'm the product of you either pass or you don't, you know, the Architectural Association. But I think that these, without wanting to go into too much detail in terms of grading systems, I think it is a problem of nomenclature and the way that we call things, I think. And that's one of the most important things that we really need to, I would almost like to just throw it out of the window or the bath.
Okay.
If I can jump in, or Deborah, were you going to say something?
No, Robert, please go ahead.
No, I'm in complete agreement, and I think it reminds me. I mean, in the harshest terms, it's sort of the master-servant narrative, but it reminds me of bell Hooks's writings on many kingdoms of professors, and I think we need to think more about self-assessment and the assessment that comes out of self-constructive criticism. We mentioned this before when we were chatting as a pre-panel discussion. We were talking about the jury system and sort of the invention of that jury system in 1865 at MIT, the first school of architecture in the US, and that there was no kind of public performance to see whether someone was up for it and was publicly evaluated. I mean, that is a complete invention. So I think we are at a moment where assessment can be broadened, and in particular self-assessment modalities that are out there.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I can jump into, I agree with Nasreen. I think the word performance is really weird. And I probably hadn't really thought about it until she brought it up, but I agree completely. Like, what is going on with that funny word? And assessment, yes, is certainly true. And I think what but we also always look disciplinary. You know, there's the people who know, who are assessing the juniors coming up. But in the last year, you know, hopefully many institutions have gone through some sort of self-assessment. I know we tried to do it at MIT, and other institutions have looked at their curriculum and looked at their stuff like you guys do, and faculty have sat around, and we're, you know, having all sorts of late night meetings, you know, talking about our curriculum now. You know, you could say, well, why did it have to wait so damn long again? But okay, better late than never. So, you know, assessment also means you got to look at your own stuff. That's really hard to do, you know, because we can say, listen, why can't we do this in the studio? And then the next year, the studio announcements come out and they look like last year, right? Because it's hard for people to change, right? Especially senior faculty, they're not going to change. Many junior faculty can't change because they're roped into research projects which aren't going to change because their funding streams are not flexible. There are many, many reasons why inflexibility is written into the academic system. That assessment is important.
The need for a first professional degree to be approved by the accrediting board. So for professional education, at least as it's currently structured in the United States, it goes beyond what you want to put in your curriculum. You in turn then have to make sure that the accrediting board approves what you teach and how you teach it, I love what you just said, Mark, about self-assessment and a sort of constant re-examination of curriculum, which we at Yale did before the pandemic, because I came in after a dean who had been in place for almost 20 years and was still mired in the 20th century, even though we were well into the 21st. But at a certain point, you get beyond the academy and you hit the wall of accreditation. And I think if we continue to run professional schools, at least in the United States, that prepare people for licensure, we're going to have to confront those folks and say, we need to look at this all differently if the profession wants to change in the way it says it does.
Well, I also think that, you know, the sort of fine grading that we do, the A to D or A to F, is something that's doesn't really get at learning, and it doesn't get at the creation of new knowledge, and that assessments are a conversation between faculty and student, and assessments of the program are something that should be continuous improvement. You know, should be a goal for any organization that is regulated and measured as architects are.
Okay, so I guess, you know, it responds to one of the sort of hard questions that has been asked by students. So I think students will get a very nuanced picture of the future of assessment from your responses. I want to, since Nasreen brought up the Pritzker Prize issue, I want to get back to that. Nasreen, thank you for bringing it up. And I have been.
What is the issue, Adnan? What is the issue? Could you tell me?
Yes, that's what I want to do. So if you look at and I know that Deborah is serving on the Pritzker Prize committee. So if you look at the last 5-6 years of awardees, there is an indication that the mainstream architectural establishment is ready more than ever before to reward the non-monumental and specialities that are more interested in social problems than indulging in aesthetic heroism and gymnastics. So my question to you all, would these supra tendencies influence architectural schools in the wake of a global pandemic that has exposed so much of our existing social vulnerabilities, inequities? So in other words, can we take some clue in the ways awards are being given to, perhaps you have been alluding to this, perhaps to reform curriculum, kind of completely dismantle the ideas of assessment, and so on. So in other words, my question is, if how these mainstream architectural institutions giving awards to architects, taking some clue from that, can we argue that architectural education in the future will increasingly become tactical and activist?
Yeah.
Can I give you a good example of this? I'm sure that everybody has seen these films, but a fantastic example of this is the Oscars. Pritzker Prize, the Oscars. Iranian cinema Persian films has gone to become one of the most incredibly, not lucrative, but most incredibly critical ways of talking about what has happened politically in that country for the past 40 years. None of those films that have made it to become the language of a political turmoil have gotten an Oscar. Does that mean that the film schools, that one of the most incredible, now dead, directors, Kiarostami, made in Iran, which has become the beginning of many schools of film, does that mean that those schools have taken any sort of word from the Oscars? No. From Cannes, maybe only 2 films were awarded. So my point is, awards are something, the architecture profession is something, and it doesn't mean one is real and the other one is not real. And the education of architecture is something else.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't bring these to that's why I said,
But I think,
let's put it aside.
but Adnan, are you asking though, I mean, is the recent win by Lacaton and Vassal, is that going to shift that they were put on a pedestal, and that firms like this, and some people were very unhappy that they won, were not put on pedestals previous. So is that what your question is?
My question is, for 5, 6, 7 years, Shigeru Ban, Balkrishna Doshi, many people in India was outraged that Doshi received the Pritzker so late in his life. He deserved it much earlier. So there's a kind of there is an illusion that this awarding by Pritzker and other mainstream institutions, there is a tendency to finally celebrate the non-heroic. I think there's an illusion. So my question to you is that, does the pandemic give us an opportunity to revisit this notion that the mainstream architectural establishments are getting away from the heroic, the white male hero, architecture by white males, and then there have been openings that have been made to see alternative ways of doing architecture. Has that moment arrived, or it's an illusion, or can we perhaps bring that to architectural curriculum? That is the question.
I don't know, Adnan, if the Pritzker means anything in the halls of education. I mean, I didn't even know that the award would be given out until I talked to a colleague of mine, who's a professional. And he said, "Oh, the Pritzker just been announced." No one has mentioned it in any of the talks I had, students don't talk about it. No one really gives a damn. I mean, it's important at some level of professional things, but in education, I mean, anyone who cares about it, shouldn't be in school then.
Okay, so Deborah, you raised your hand.
Well, I just want to say I both agree with Nasreen that if awards set the path for what we did, we'd be in trouble as a globe, whether it's the Nobel or the Oscar or the Pritzker or the whatever, right? Awards are usually late to the game and slow to speak value. I think the trend we are seeing in architectural education with a greater concern, should we say, for what I called in my introductory remarks, the greater good, as opposed to the egocentric monument, egocentric of the maker and egocentric of the client, it is a pendulum swing, unfortunately, and we are way in one direction, and I would like to keep us in the more socially aware direction for as long as possible. But I promise you, when all of us are long out of this business, the pendulum is going to go back the other way, and we're going to have a bunch of people who want to make monuments again. But for right now, we better get all of this concern for the good of everybody else. We should get as much out of it as we possibly can.
Okay, I have one more question that I think students would be very interested in listening your responses to. What is the future of the student-teacher relationship, especially when the current remote teaching might leave strong traces of virtuality in the future learning environments? Peer learning and support are integral to architecture schools. Furthermore, our ability to inspire students has a strong history of physical proximity. The possibilities of physical nearness between the teacher and the student, the serendipitous encounters in the hallway, and hearing the students' collective laughter in the classroom after a joke tend to fade in the virtual space of Zoom. How might social distancing and virtuality change the very nature of the student-teacher relationship, and their mutual dependency?
I think that's one area where the AIAS has been working effortlessly and trying to finally construct almost a manifesto around studio culture for schools. And I think that is one aspect of academia that has been completely crushed. And all that you mentioned, Adnan, the serendipitous relationships, sort of the collective design thinking that takes place when people are working on projects next to other people, and you're listening to someone else's desk crit, and you're sort of anticipating that you're next. I mean, all of that has been completely thrown out. So I think that post-pandemic, we're going to run back to that as fast as we can.
Yeah, we're going to dilute this intense Zoom experience because it's insufficient, but we're not going to let go of it because it's really great for some things. And just like anything in appropriate amounts, it's going to prove to be very valuable. But the peer-to-peer learning is really critical. And, I think when we talk about assessments, peer-to-peer assessments, not only amongst themselves in current time, but looking to their peers in prior years and looking at what students accomplished in previous studios is something that infuses studio culture. I remember at school knowing very well key projects that had been recognized, years past, and that these were touchstones for those of us, growing and learning.
Anybody else? Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, I think to maybe build on that a little bit, the studio is valuable, and we can't get rid of that for many reasons that just been outlined both by Mark and Robert. And design thinking, in my little talk, I was trying to sort of say that there's a sort of a second benefit of design thinking, which isn't just becoming a better architect because you understand the discipline and the languages and the vocalization of intentionality, but it's something that happens back, hopefully, back into you ontologically. When you realize there are people in the group who come from different places, who speak different languages, who have different struggles, who have different genders. In other words, and that type of thinking is not something that you can assess, right? It's something that you have to embrace and want, and have to see how the studio helps you basically compress that and makes you a better person as well, right? So it's not just building a better community, but you also have to build a better and stronger and more robust ontological framework. And to do that, you got to get out of your shell and out of the assumption that you know the answer simply because you know a lot. And you have to be challenged by people who look at you and don't understand what the hell you're talking about, and will tell you. And I think there's something very valuable about that. And I think that's going to be, that's why the 21st century, type of studio is going to be significantly different from the long 19th century studio which we've had in the past.
Yeah, that's why I would advocate for not coming back, but revisiting something that Baudouin and Lodz designed in 1931, which was the open air school. And that the studio doesn't have to be in a studio. The world is a studio for us. So as a consequence, we have to get out there. We can, you walk with your students. You don't have to be, you can be in open air. And we have to, I think Deborah said this at the beginning when she was talking about her, the general issues that are really sort of out there, not only the pandemic, and that is, we cannot only think of spaces that are going to be catering to this pandemic, because there are other ones that are going to come and we don't even know what is out there for us. So I think that if we begin to really look at this, we really need to take this sort of jacket inside out and completely use the capacities that we have. I mean, walking as a way of understanding the city or the territory is a very different thing than the slides that one sees in the studio. And quite frankly, some of the teaching on Zoom actually enables some types of students. Asian students are very, very timid when it comes to discussions in class. So when you have a seminar, almost nobody speaks, even if you bring them to understanding how they deal with questioning and interrogation. Whereas on chat, they are extremely chatty when it comes to electives or when it comes to seminars online. So I think that we really need to sort of take the pulse of every different teaching at a different and record all of these and begin to record, not recording it, but record them as in terms of inscribing them in order to bring them into new types of structures of teaching.
Okay, Deborah, the final word on this?
I don't really have a final word other than to say I think we should make sure we continue what we're doing with the same energy that this kind of conversation inspires, which is maybe to talk more to each other, talk more to our students, keep all forms of communication open, both in Zoom and in studio and on long walks, all of that, because the best next generation of architects are going to be those who are most broadly, what was your wonderful expression, Mark J? World opening is to have your eyes open, your ears open, your mind open, and your heart open as you experience the world, and then bring that back to design.
Okay, so that's the time we have for our conversation. So I would like now to invite my colleague, Tonya Onstad, to moderate the Q&A. So Tonya, are you here? Tonya, are you here? Yes, Tonya. So you can access the questions in the Q&A function.
I don't see any questions yet. I think Julia will send them over as you.
Julia, can you make Tonya a host so that she can see the questions?
I'm sending them to her right now for you.
Okay. So yeah, so we have some questions. So Tonya, you can take them away.
Well, this is kind of awesome because it's like a nerdy it's like a nerdy backstage pass here to all of you that I've been following, and my awesome new boss, Mark, to be here. So thanks for having me. I am going to read through these, and I would like to encourage all of you out there to start asking some questions so that I can't keep up in the feed. But I'll ask one question while I'm waiting. I was trying to think of the best way to word this, but I wanted to ask everyone if you were to sort of like, this reminds me, this kind of like super intense level conversation reminds me of my years in grad school and suffering sometimes from not always understanding the conversation. And I wanted to ask you one question, which would be if you could go back just a few years and get back into your student mind, when you're kind of like overfilled with optimism, and 70 years of practice in front of you, what would you think about in your school? What would be the most important thing for you to address?
Wow. For me, I
Asking us to go back in time, so to speak.
Yeah, like a blip, like the blip. Well, you know what happened. You just, everything you know now.
You were very kind to say just go back just a few years, because frankly, it's been very many. But for me, since I went to RISD to do a Bachelor of Architecture, so I was at an art school, I am sorry I did not go out and take, it almost gets back to the comment I made before about needing open ears, open eyes, open mind, and an open heart to really be any good at this, was that I had gone up the hill to Brown more often and maybe elsewhere as well, to learn as much about other things as I possibly could in order to be a better architect.
Tonya, do you see the questions?
I see the questions.
Okay, so Robert, you wanted to respond to Tonia's question, I believe.
Yeah, I was going to say, now that I'm running a school that's multidisciplinary, I also feel like, and it's connected in some way to the Pritzker question, because in my early formation as an architect at UT Austin, we were kind of Pritzker bound in the sense that we were studying the great architects and the making of great architects. And it was so unidirectional to do that. And I agree, when I got to MIT, it was the first time I took courses in other disciplines. The media lab was the most wonderful exploration for us, and we had a great connection with them. And I wish I would have taken more courses outside of the discipline all the way through, especially as an undergrad. And I know we talk about this with our electives and with our approved electives for our undergraduate curricula. And that was probably the most disservice to myself. I never took one course in landscape architecture. I never took one course in community and regional planning. We were so focused on just that one disciplinary track. That's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, I love your question. And Robert and Deborah, I left school with similar appetite to learn new things. And I'm kind of torn whether or not I should have fed that appetite as a young person and had just more to work with as an evolving, practicing architect, or if that appetite actually served greater purpose to continue to drive my interest in practice and interest in ideas, and to continue learning. So kind of felt I left school with more questions than answers. And for years I complained that I wish I'd gotten more hard knowledge, more direction. But in fact, I think not getting that might be the greater reward.
I can answer because by all definitions, I had a very excellent education, design education, and so forth and so on. Came to MIT to study PhD. In 1882, I took a trip with some friends to Istanbul. And we went to Basra and other places. And I tell you, it was like, I felt all over like, why didn't I get this in school? Why have I gone through supposedly some of the best architectural program, at the ETH and then at MIT, and I knew nothing about Islamic architecture. I knew nothing about Islam. So, I came from a standard Eurocentric background, and I thought I knew what architecture was all about. I mean, I was trained to be an architect, that could work anywhere in the world, and I was given full confidence that I could do that. And then I went to Istanbul, and I'm going, what is this place? And it was that sort of weird humiliation of my ignorance, and that I confess, that sort of launched the whole career as to sort of, this is just one step, and I'm going to have to take all the others. So that's why students need to travel. They got to get out in the world. They got to feel uncomfortable in places in order to understand what it means to be the other and not to be the normative.
I don't know. It's I was at the AA, so we did everything except architecture. We didn't learn how to put a building together, but I didn't do too badly as soon as I came out and went into a total commercial office. And, I got a raise after about 7 months of 25%, which was unheard of. So I don't know what it is that I would have done differently. I would have probably liked to have done a sort of a degree in civil engineering, but and I thought of that for a long time, because in fact it would have allowed my practice to just basically not have to argue about the way that one structures a building with structural engineers. But then once you begin to actually learn how to, you remember how you were talking to your sort of technical tutors from OVARAP, and you begin to talk to your engineers while you are a practicing architect, you are reminded that your education actually had a fantastic effect on you. You just have to pull it back out and have the sort of the critical angle on things in order to be able to not only use it differently, but also put yourself in a different position. So I think that the only thing that I can say is that, Alvin Boyarsky was a fantastic educator, and he, his days are finished and we're never going to make another AA. But I think that, I think that I'm quite happy how I ended up where I ended up in my practice. So I don't know what I would have done differently. I would have probably, as an exile from my own country, I would have probably done something to maybe go back and do something in Iran, but I don't really see that. Coming back to the question that Mark brought in, I wrote a fantastic, I don't know if it was fantastic. I don't know, because we wouldn't get an A or a B. I got a good pass on it, about a mosque that I didn't know anything about in Iran, which always had attracted me, the Friday Mosque in Isfahan, which basically is a sort of an articulation between the bazaar and that at the AA, because of the fact that we had somebody that was a fantastic sort of expert on Islamic architecture. But so the AA was this sort of melting pot out of all of these weirdos at the time, and it was a great moment to go through it. One of those weirdos happened to be a student called Zaha Hadid, and his teacher at the time was writing the Lyris New York in Manhattan. So I suppose it's where you are, when you are, and what you do architecture for that takes you to another place.
All of these are really interesting responses, and I'm thinking there's a question that came up that really relates to this, thinking about all of your experiences. And it sounds like there wouldn't be any major changes, but one question from Douglas Palladino says, when you suggest that faculty might teach at multiple schools, what about students teaching at, or attending classes at multiple schools? And then I think I would tag on to Doug's question by saying, if we could kind of get over ourselves and our institutions and think about the greater good, like the greater education of architects, would this be a good idea?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Getting out and seeing how other people think and live. Mark, yeah, world opening. I think that's a great way of expressing the way Deborah says, opening your eyes and your ears and your heart to the rest of the world. I think that's I don't know if it's a mature person's realization or if it's something that people have as young people. I don't know, but it is something that you come to realize at some point in this business, that this is the pathway to being effective for your clients and being effective for the people that support you in your business and being effective as a teacher. So yes, exchange programs, doing things in parallel, comparing notes from different places with different faculty, but yet, working on some common problem, but coming at it in different ways.
Yeah, I think just the concept of semester abroad, domestic abroad or abroad, we're going to have to, it's going to be a reciprocity nightmare. We're going to have to work with lots of articulation agreements or different ways, but schools are already doing that. And why not? Why not see what's next door and tap into what's next door? It's sort of, it's the opposite in many ways of what Nasreen is capturing, where you are at a school at the right moment with all of these players and you're part of that. And we've all experienced that, but I think that's going to be part of the mix, that you were at this place where, you were a visiting student and this other person was a visiting student and you met at another university. And I think we're going to see new scenarios in the future, hopefully.
Okay, the next question from Professor Julio Bermudez. I agree with Deborah's initial statement that the most important thing for architectural education today is addressing the big challenges that we as a people, as a civilization, are facing, especially since it's when our students will be living most of their lives in that very future time. Aren't the problems we face, such as global warming, environmental destruction, consumerism, economic inequity, racism, technological blindness, etc., problems that arise from within ourselves? Problems of values and spirit. How should immaterial, even metaphysical issues enter architectural education? That's a good one.
Okay, that's a great question. Metaphysics is everywhere. That's a problem. In school, a school of architecture is a metaphysical project because it brings together people all of different sorts and then industrializes them and spits them out into a particular way. And that's what metaphysics does. It makes everybody, I don't want to say uniform is sort of the wrong way, but it sort of gets everybody to think in alignment with a certain goal. And of course, there's great opportunities in that. I mean, there's a reason we do this. I mean, to solve problems, but the problem is with that is that it can sort of over-determine and be much too narrow, and we're solving a problem, but we're making 10 new ones, and we don't see it. And I think, education has to loosen up a little bit. And whether it's, through exchange programs or whatever it is, the old conventional problem solving through expertise, well, we've been doing that since the 20s, that's what technology does anyway. That's what modernism does anyway. We know how to do that in our sleep. But how do we find contrarian positions? And how do we respect contrarian positions and sort of assess those in a particular way? Well, that's really difficult to do. And we need experiments that fail to do that. You know, so it means we need a certain, I don't know, fatness into the system where we can say that failed and that failed, or that didn't work, or that worked, but hey, that might have worked, you know, we don't know. So, you know, if it's too narrow and too precise, and we're only thinking in terms of the end goal for some problem solving tomorrow, it's definitely not going to work. But getting a fatness into the system where there are experiments and failures and successes, and we don't really know, and tolerating that, that's, you know, part of the issue.
There's a question earlier, and I'm sorry, I don't know the name that it comes from, but it's from a student, I think. So how do you think our classes of students will be behind when entering the real world profession? I think that kind of follows up on the.
I read that question. I read it, and it sounds, I mean, it has sort of a internal negativity, like we are now all behind because of what just happened. But I've thought about this. You know, we're global. We're able to pivot to work in other media, you know, at a moment of triage, but we can do it. And I think it's going to make everyone wiser. I don't think we're going to get behind. Our students are not going to be behind. They're going to be ahead. They've tackled some pretty complex issues at a moment's notice. So I read that question thinking, it's you're ahead. Look what we just accomplished. We were able to do this.
I completely agree. You know, having to adapt to the pandemic and the quarantine took ingenuity, it took imagination, it took grit. It also took sort of looking at ourselves and the way that we do things and making adjustments, realizing what we can't do, really realizing what we can do. It wasn't something that we wished on ourselves, but it was it was a challenge, and it's going to, in the end, it's going to advance everyone's career. And you know, what students are going through is exactly what practices are going through. It's what the rest of the world's going through. So you're coming along with everyone else. And if anything, you're better prepared than you would be if you were in studio and all the practices are online.
Are there, so there are some questions about sort of curriculum, and maybe I'll just, they kind of, one question from Jeremy Fred says, in undergraduate education, is the omnipresence of studio, say 10 semesters, too much? It would seem to limit those opportunities to get further exposure to other topics being mentioned.
We have a 6-year program. Right, that's a long time. That's time to study other things. It's a really good question because not every graduate goes on to practice architecture. Graduates go into other disciplines. But design is the core of what an architect does. I think when you strip away the things that other people do as well, you have design. And you have design thinking, and letting that be the thread, you know, through your entire career at school makes sense.
But don't you think that the question is more toward, you know, I mean, this may be, but undergraduate curricula, as far as I know them, both in America and in Europe, and everywhere in the world, it's mainly looking at sort of a learning by mimicking the practice. So, you know, they get a school to do, they get a house to do, I think the question is that once you begin to give 10 semesters of that, students, by the time they have finished their undergraduate, they haven't got much more experience of that leads them to go anywhere else. They may just get completely disappointed by architecture and therefore they go to something else. I really do think that we need to change the idea of, we almost need to come back to architecture undergraduate as not only liberal arts, but almost as the classics in a way, you know, that you need to speak a series of languages in order to be able to speak other languages. And that's where I think that the most curricula are sort of selling our education short, because the students need to, even if you keep the structure of the studio, as you were saying, as the design sort of practice in the studio, the topics and the subjects need to be a little bit more sort of, you know, I think world opening, let's call it.
But mimicry or emulation is a starting point, right? I mean, that's
Yeah, that's where we probably completely disagree. I would be for completely putting a cross over this sort of learning by mimicry.
Okay.
I mean, one aspect of my education at ETH, which was very wonderful, was called a Seminarwoche, and once a semester for a week you would travel with a professor somewhere in the world. So we went to Italy, we went to France, we went to Ukraine, we went here and there, and to look at buildings. And you know, I think most of my education was relatively forgettable, but those trips were not. And you know, traveling with a professor, you know, and standing in front of buildings and talking about them and looking about them and sketching, and my God, I mean, those are really fantastic things. Much more so than what you're going to get in some studio where you walk with white paper and you make black lines on the damn computer now, and you think you're an architect simply because the computer can finish it for you and you make a rendering after 10 minutes, you know, but you know nothing and you haven't seen anything, you know. And it's not so much the studio is the problem, it's the computer, you know, type of education, which is, you know, banalizes the whole idea of studio, you know.
Mark, that is, I mean, that's I've been doing this with Hong Kong U for the past 4 years, in fact, summer program in Paris, and it's I have 22 students that I take all over the place, and when we go back, they produce a book it's called a graphic novel, and they take very specific moments of their journeys and they redefine through their, it's a model of a sort of something between a psychogeographic map of Paris plus their ideas of structure, how they see stone as opposed to metal, as opposed to, and they learn out of that much more than they do in a studio, which is about metal trusses, you know. So I think it's also this vision, viewing, seeing something, being able to touch it, being able to understand it, and then being able to sort of design beyond it, you know. So I think that is still this sort of absolute being in touch with these things is still quite an important issue.
Right. I mean, you can teach Brunelleschi's dome, but until you've climbed up to the top of it, which if any of you haven't done, you're missing one of the greatest architectural experiences in the world. Then you know why you teach Brunelleschi's dome. But only then.
Well, you need a repertoire, right? As a student, I mean, to think that you could come in your first year or second year, design buildings without experience, without repertoire, without looking, analyzing. It's a very slow process of accumulating those experiences, which become the raw material for design. And it's a little, I think we may get ahead of ourselves in expecting students to have more of a language to express architecture in early years, and that we should really spend our time on developing those languages.
Tonya, we are almost at the end of our Q&A. Do you want to take David Rifkin's question? I think it's really important. David Rifkin's question. Do you see it?
I do, thank you. So he says, thank you for the terrific conversation regarding Deborah's point about the central importance of justice in our curricula. How do we address the demands of professional accreditation to reproduce the profession as it exists when professional practice has been so complicit in building an unjust world?
I have an answer for that. I think one of the core courses that has gone sort of unanalyzed is professional practice. And professional practice, I think, is the one course in the curricula, at least in US institutions, where those problematic practices in firm world are replicated. And I think that's one area where, and to answer David's question, justice appears in studio. It can be part of the seminar sequence. It can definitely, there are specialty courses. It's often seen as an elective, but it's often outside of the realm of when we're learning about practice. So one thing we're doing at UNM is we're actually rebuilding that course entirely, so that we're looking at alternative forms of practice, cooperatives. We have someone who is connected to the architectural lobby, as I am. I'm on the board too, and we're looking at labor justice issues very closely. So there are places where we can reframe courses, rethink the way courses are taught, traditionally taught. When I took professional practice, we studied the AIA contract. We were sort of immersed in the practices of just a traditional practice. So there are places where we can do both, I think, where we can rebuild, rethink coursework, and then also work with accreditation criteria.
It's a great question. And I think getting back, I think it was Nazreen who talked about, or maybe it was Deborah, about, construction industry, and so there's a professional practice, but, we also got to remember there's also privilege and all sorts of justice and injustice issues in the construction industry that we relate to, right? Just reading a book by a woman who was like the first carpenter here in Massachusetts to be accepted by the union, and this was only published like 6 years ago. So the labor unions in Massachusetts are basically all men in the carpenters union, right? And so she had all sorts of problems, right, getting accepted. So women in the construction industry is a big problem. It's not anything architects ever talk about, but we should, we should make a claim about that, not just women, but minorities and so forth. And there is is equally big problem as in architecture itself, but that's been a silent, issue, forever in a way, right? Because we just assume that's their problem, but maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe it should be the architecture problem.
Tonya, can you take the one last question, please? Perhaps Milton.
About flying. Should we take the last question? Okay. So again, thanks everyone for all the questions. This is the first time that I've had more questions than I could get through. So I wish this was a whole nother hour. But a question from Kim Ursel, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. It says, what about the energy used by airplanes and traveling throughout the world? Is it really the right thing? It seems to be a matter of privilege.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, privilege is part and parcel to the academy. And I remember as an undergrad at UT Austin, where our dean and our administration would say, we're incredibly wealthy. It's oil money. We can do anything we want. And we would go to our deans and or associate deans. We were sort of exploring travel programs. and they would just say, where do you want to go? And we can get you there. And so that's UT Austin, which is unlike most state schools. But there is that layer of privilege that is a part of all of this, getting into the right school. We have faculty, I mean, at UNM, we're dealing with food banks. We're dealing with food banks across campus. We're dealing with students and faculty, but mostly students who are dealing with just getting a meal. So yeah, it's hard for us. I mean, we're talking about these wonderful experiences. Why aren't we traveling? Why aren't we going to see, these wonderful mosques and learning about Islamic architecture? But the reality of just trying to get into a program, into a field of study and making it through is front and center. And I think we have it's a privileged discipline. I mean, we study the canon is the study of, in many cases, the second or third homes of very wealthy people by starchitects. So we have to. There's a lot of introspection that needs to take place to see how we can get beyond this, not just for the for the sake of the carbon footprint, but also for access, so that people feel like they're completely equally able to access what everyone else can.
I think just a quick rejoinder to that, if I could. You're perfectly right. I mean, I have miles up to wazoo, and this is the first time in my life I haven't traveled, obviously for the year. And I had 3 world trips planned and all that type of stuff. So I'm definitely guilty as charged. But I've also changed my teaching. So when I teach mosques now in my lecture, I show a mosque and there's one. And then I said, where is this mosque? And everyone thinks, well, it's probably in some Islamic country. I said, no, it's in Watertown. 2 miles from where I live. And so why don't we do a meet next week? And I want all of you to go there and visit it. And the same thing with when I teach, when I get to my survey class and I teach Hinduism, I do the Hindu mosque, which is maybe 3 miles away. And there the students are like, their eyes pop out of their head, because many of them don't realize that, these worlds are, these are locals. These are local people, our people. You don't have to go to Istanbul necessarily and spend a lot of money. You can just literally go down the street and go in a mosque. That's an opportunity that I didn't have when I was growing up. But that's very different now. That's different with this generation and sort of my parents' generation, who would, I don't know in Boston when the first mosque was built here, but it was maybe 10 years ago. So in other words, it's a very different world now.
Yeah, I think we can also modulate our appetite for travel, and it can be around the world, but it could also be local. It could be done on a bicycle, and you can discover, if you're observant, you can discover the kinds of differences and qualities that inspire you when you visit a mosque in Turkey. It's a different thing. It might be not as extraordinary, but it offers similar lessons.
Absolutely.
Tonya, I think that's the time we have. Thank you so much for moderating the questions. Tonya, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
So I guess that's the time we have. And I want to just reiterate one earlier point that I was trying to make, is that whether we believe that this pandemic has been merely a hiccup in the annals of our learning, or it's a paradigm shift moment that becomes ultimately irrelevant, we have a huge responsibility to solve real problems in the world. So that is the main message, that finding some faith in what we do, in its ability to solve problems in the world, like climate change, like social injustice, and so on. So I think that's the message. The pandemic, the 1 year or more, has given us some pause, I believe, and I hope that you would all agree that it gave us some space to think about issues before us in some depth and what we can do about it. Our solutions or our responses to these problems or issues may be different, but at the end of the day, I think we can believe that we had that opportunity to think about these issues. I want to clarify one question that I asked about Pritzker Prize. By no means I meant that Pritzker Prize is a barometer of what is going on in architecture, or we should be working toward getting a Pritzker Prize. That's not what I meant. What I meant was a bit of a rhetorical question that if Pritzker Prize is giving these awards to these people, like Shigeru Ban or Doshi or recent awardees, can we take these awards as a way of looking at some of the shifts that were happening in architecture? If we take the liberty of looking at the Pritzker Prize without valorizing it, if we look at the awardees in the past 7-8 years, can we take that as a way of measuring, assessing, analyzing, or reflecting on what is going on from the perspective of mainstream architectural establishments? That was my point. And it can be ironic. It can be paradoxical that Oscar is also kind of using the optics of diversity. In real practice, it doesn't happen. So I think that is what I was trying to get at. So by no means I know that there is a question. By no means I meant that Pritzker Prize is the ultimate accolade we should be aspiring to. By no means, I didn't mean that. I didn't suggest that. I was just using it as a barometer, to maybe a faulty barometer, to assess what is going on in architectural practice from the mainstream vantage point. That's all I meant. So I would like to thank all our panelists and for our panelists for their valuable comments and insights. It's been fascinating. I would like to apologize on behalf of Deborah, who has to introduce another speaker at her school at Yale, so she needed to leave early. But other than that, I think this was a wonderful experience and conversation. I would like to thank you for spending the time with us and during this busy time of the semester. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adnan. Pleasure to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Adnan. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all our attendees. Thank you.